All right, welcome to our second GFF panel of actual conference panelists rather than keynote speakers. And we want to use the time today to discuss science fiction and historical voices. As the usual procedure is that if you have any questions during any of the talks, if it just comes up, just type it in the chat. I will pick up on it later during the discussion. And we're going to go in the order of the speakers on the program. So our first talk today is by Torsten Kathke on From Future Shock to Winning the Future, Newt Gingrich's SF Politics. And without further ado, I'm going to turn myself off, and it's your turn, Torsten.
Thank you, Sabrina. Thank you to the organizers for actually making this happen in the time of COVID. I originally meant to give my longer paper on kind of the trajectory of the politics of one Newt Gingrich, who might be familiar to people. And I'm still going to do that, but I have decided to cut it down to size a little bit and focus on the thing that is most important to me in looking at Newt Gingrich and looking at his, as I call them, SF politics, sci-fi in the larger sense, politics, and what that has to do with the current political moment. So let me just give you a little bit of context. The idea that I am working with is that Newt Gingrich read this book. This is not a speculation. It's very clear that he did. It is one of the most read books of the 1970s. It has given rise to a documentary movie. It has influenced music. It has influenced whole genres of literature. It has influenced sociology. It creeps up everywhere. And Newt Gingrich, who at the time was working on his career as a historian that did not quite go as originally planned, read this book in the early 1970s and came to a conference to meet its authors. And when I say authors, the book says Alvin Toffler on the cover, but it was written as all the other books. There are three in this trilogy about life in the future by Alvin and Heidi Toffler, a couple of former Marxist organizers turned popular futurologists and later organizers of a think tank and people who would tell politicians what to do. So you can see already the strands that connect that. Now, Newt Gingrich reads this. It's very influential in the time, and it is very influential to the politics of Newt Gingrich. Because Newt Gingrich then becomes a representative in Congress, and he becomes known very quickly, and Julian Zelizer just published a new book in 2020 called Burning Down the House about Newt Gingrich's time in the US Congress. He starts, or really much furthers, this style of politics that we think of when we think of Republican politics in the United States today. It's very combative. It's about winning. It's about breaking norms and institutions in order to win. And this is really the connecting strand, because Future Shock, this book, which here came in several different popular colors, this book suggested that we lived in a time in the 1970s of a changing pace of change, of an accelerating pace of change itself. Now, that in itself is not really that new. That is something that we've already had in the 19th century. It keeps coming up again and again. But the argument that Future Shock specifically made was that the pace of change itself was so great that you could no longer even adapt to it. You could just adapt to having to change constantly. And the idea that norms and institutions and the way that things were done, supposedly what conservative politics were about, went out of the window there, that is something that connects Newt Gingrich to the Tofflers. This is the idea that he took with him and that he based his politics on. And it's not just Newt Gingrich, it's not just a combative young Turk in the House of Representatives. As Sean Theriault argues in his book, The Gingrich Senators, this style of politics was in essence inculcated in the people in Congress, in the Republicans in Congress, and those who then went from the House to Congress, who were first congressmen, in essence, all of them, and then later senators, they took this style of politics with them. So for me, the interesting part here is that it is a kind of a thing you don't often see. You see a kind of very direct translation of ideas that come out of a popular nonfiction book on the state of society, on the state of the present, the past, and the future. And it is being not just used in politics in terms of an idea, but in terms of how politics itself is done. So the importance for me is the temporality of connecting the future to the past here. And Newt Gingrich, as a historian, looking towards the future, using this idea, these ideas, and turning them in essence an ideology, and bringing them to the Republican majority in the House in 1994, then gives us the state of American politics today. This is a very simplified way of it, and of course the strands that connected go back much further, but it is undeniable that Gingrich was very influential here. This is testament to that. This was published as, in essence, the embodiment of the reading list that Newt Gingrich gave to every new Republican elected to Congress in the 1994 sweep in the era of Clinton, in which began this cantankerous period in American politics with Gingrich and the Clinton affair and Gingrich's role in that and all of that. And here are writings by Alvin and Heidi Toffler, specifically edited and endorsed by Newt Gingrich to bring forth a certain type of politics. And in essence, that is it. This is my very distilled version of what I wanted to talk about. I just wanted to draw this line. I know it comes across as a very simple A to B thing here. It is, of course, not that simple, but I think it is going to give us enough to start talking about and to start connecting, again, the strands to the other papers that we're going to hear. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So we are going to move on to our second talk, which is by Bodie Ashton on Hier, Märchen von Übermorgen, Raumpatrouille, and Rethinking Germany's Place in the Global Future. So on to you, Bodie.
Oh, yay. Well, first of all, thank you to, first off, Torsten for having the first of the discussions today, and certainly we'll be talking about some of those strands a little bit later. Once again, I want to reiterate the whole thank you to the organizers. Thank you to people who are actually turning up for this at the moment. Obviously, this year has been an absolute nightmare. So the fact that something like this is actually working like this, I think, is wonderful. It kind of feels like a podcast setup. I feel like I should have a glass of red wine or something. But anyway, I just want to actually give a brief introduction to myself first, because I want to use that as a stepping stone to a very, I should say, simple presentation or demi-presentation today, which is simply to say that, I mean, to begin with, I'm Bodie Ashton. I am a historian, and that's really the important point that I want to make here, which is that I am a historian, and I'm coming to science fiction purely out of my own interest, really. So it's much less to do with something that I study in depth. I'm definitely not a scholar of sci-fi or of SF literature, of television, of film, of anything like that. But what I do is what I call identity history. So as a historian of identity, I tend to focus on what elements make a community and make an individual. How do we put together our own identities? Because an identity is something that is constructed. And we choose what to emphasize in that identity, and we choose what we want to present to the outside world and what we want the outside world to take from what we present. And with that in mind, I focus mostly on Germany as a historian, and I've written so far in the 19th century, so this seems like a bit of a strange jump. But my love of science fiction brought me to this cult television show called Raumpatrouille, or Space Patrol, which was a German production. It was actually produced by the Bavaria Film Studios. It appeared first on ARD, so one of the German open public television stations, only 9 days after Star Trek premiered in the United States. And in some ways, they're quite comparable, not just because of the fact that they exist at the same time, but because they deal with many of the same sort of themes that run through them. The point that comes about for me here that is most interesting for me is the fact that whereas Star Trek ends up becoming this enormous franchise, and of course we're now into series number whatever, I've lost track of them now, and we're well into 700 plus episodes. I think we're approaching 800 or so. There are many thousands of novels that go with this as well that aren't considered canon, but they still exist in that regard. And as a result, we know a lot about the background sort of future history of the Federation and so on. Raumpatrouille is very different in the sense that it only lasts for 7 episodes. And in those 7 episodes, if you're only going to have episodes that are an hour or so long, you have a bit less than 7 hours to be able to present what you want to present to an audience. So whatever time the producers take to present a past history, or a future history, I should say, a history of our future and a history of their past, is time that they have to dedicate to that quite specifically. So it must serve a purpose. And the history that is presented in the background of Raumpatrouille is for me extremely interesting. So I want to just briefly quote from the opening monologue of the show. So at the very, very beginning, when it has the rousing theme tune and so on, and it gives us the highlights of the show, the translated monologue to begin with is, and I quote here, "What may sound like a fairy tale today may be tomorrow's reality. This is a fairy tale from the day after tomorrow. There are no more nation states. There is only mankind and its colonies in space. People have settled on faraway stars. The ocean floor has been made habitable. At speeds still unimaginable today, space vessels are rushing through our Milky Way. One of these vessels is the Orion, a minuscule part of a gigantic security system protecting the Earth from threats from outer space. Let us accompany the Orion and her crew on their patrol at the edge of infinity." Which is not only extremely poetic, obviously, but what strikes me as being really interesting to begin with here, and already very provocative, is the fact that the first thing we're told about this future, this fairy tale from the day after tomorrow, is that nation states don't exist anymore. I mean, this is immediately an abrogation of the very idea of nationalism. And when we consider what society is making this show that is effectively saying nationalism is nonsense and there is no such thing as a nation state in our invented future that humanity progresses to, this is especially striking. I mean, this is produced only 20 years after the end of the Second World War. where, of course, I mean, I need not tell this audience the degree to which, or the extent to which nationalism was the force that was harnessed by the Germans during the Second World War. And here is a West German production completely disavowing this past. It goes a little bit further than that as well, insofar that what we have is a West German show that is written by Germans, that appears on a German television network, is financed by Germans. The language of the show is, of course, German. The cast are Germans, or at least Austro-Germans, and yet none of the characters are actually German, or in any conceivable way could be coded as German. So the protagonist of the show is Major Cliff Alistair McLean, who obviously from the name is meant to be American. I mean, it's the sort of name that someone who's never met an American comes up with as an idea of that's what a typical American name sounds like. But again, just to go through the quick list of the characters that you have on this spaceship Orion, you have Cliff Alistair McLean. His other officers are Mario De Monti, Artan Shibashi, who is apparently Japanese heritage, but obviously given the time, I mean, this is basically a German guy who puts on a dark wig. And that's basically the extent to which we're meant to be aware that he's not European. Hasse Sigbjørnsen, who obviously is Scandinavian, Helga Lagrell, and the security officer Tamara Jagelovsk. And in fact, you have also McLean's superior officer, direct superior officer, is a general by the name of Winston Woodrow Wamsler. The choice of those two first names cannot possibly be a coincidence at this time. So really what's I'm interested in here, and I can't really go into much detail in this talk today, obviously, because A, we simply haven't got the time, and B, we've hardly had the ability to go off and do further archival research and things like that in the times of COVID. But it strikes me as being a very interesting window into this identity of West Germany following the war, that we have this sort of show that appears in which Germany is very conspicuous in its absence, and Germanness, having been such an influential part of the films, but also the literature that had appeared up to that point in German language, where the discussion is of a German future. Here is a German future where there is no German future. And this, I think, is a very interesting time capsule for a West Germany that in the late 1960s is not entirely certain of its position in the world and of its position in a future time, and how it can maybe reconcile its past with that future. There are obviously other things that we'd probably want to talk about in discussion to do with this, and there are plenty of connections with what the other speakers are saying. So really, I just want to leave that there as being a quick précis and a quick introduction to what I want to do. So I look forward to talking with everyone else on this as well. Thank you.
And thank you. Our panel is, by the way, now complete. But so we're moving on immediately to our third talk by Amanda Dillon, who's gonna speak on Unheard Voices. The time-traveling woman is writer of history. So, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I want to add my thanks to everybody else's, to Torsten and Bodie for their very interesting papers so far, for the organizers and everything, for getting everything together at this kind of really, I don't want to say unprecedented time, because we know full well it's precedented, but this very difficult time with, you know, trying to handle everything all at once. So, like Bodie, I sort of need to introduce myself to help make some sense of how this paper sort of comes about. And it's actually part of a much larger project that I'll be working on at some point in the near future. Now, I currently work in a history department at the University of East Anglia, but I was actually trained as a literary scholar, and a lot of the work and research I do at the moment looks at this kind of interesting space where all of these things interconnect and intersect and overlap and do all kinds of neat stuff. So what I tend to do in terms of my research is think, okay, I could just go, okay, well, obviously this is happening in this novel because of this or that, but I'm more interested in kind of how we tell stories, why we tell stories, the storytelling aspects of history, the historical aspects of literature and things like that. And I'm especially happy when this comes in terms of science fiction, because that's what I was originally trained to do. Now, this paper sort of comes out of these questions, weirdly out of some things I was teaching a few years ago about agency and authority of historical writers, and particularly women in history. Now, traditionally, women are not particularly, shall we say, present in the historical record. Now, there are lots and lots and lots and lots of reasons not to see it that way. Obviously, women have always existed. But we do have this tendency to not see them as movers and shakers. And certainly for the longest time, historians are not really talking about women in that sense. And this has really quite dramatic effects on the historical record and the kinds of histories that we write. And it's actually kind of disturbingly recent that women have become not simply a kind of adjunct to the normal kind of historical record, but actually becoming more central to it. And I think what's really interesting about this is that this becomes a kind of political act. This movement, this shift in focus becomes a very political act in terms of the writing of history. So I think that's really, really quite important to think about. For those of you who need a really good recent example, if you know Hallie Rubenhold and her book, The Five, the reaction to that, that's basically the temerity to focus on the women that Jack the Ripper killed and stop before their murders happen. You can see just how much people are not okay with focusing on women who existed and breathed as people. So it's a lot of this paper sort of comes out of that sort of issue here. And the thing I'm kind of thinking about while I'm looking at the particular novel I've got here is something that the literary scholar Diana Wallace talks about, where she talks about historical fiction written by women and what that kind of does. And she does a lot of thinking about this in various different ways over her career. But she talks about women who write historical fiction about women as a way of simultaneously reinserting women into history, but also sort of signifying their absence by going, okay, well, obviously we don't know what happened, but we've got a version of it here. So there's that kind of thing going on. This connects to a whole wealth of other stuff I can't really talk about in 5 minutes, but it also basically says that women have this really interesting relationship to time and a really interesting relationship to history, where they are present but not necessarily seem to be moving things. So they sort of become historically inert, which is itself really, really interesting in lots and lots of ways. So my main kind of study text for the, that was going to be the study text for this paper is Connie Willis's Doomsday Book, which is basically the story of a history PhD student who goes back in time. This is a very normal thing they do, by the way, to make a study of pre-Plague era Oxford, kind of see what was going on, find out what's going on here, and report back, finish up her PhD, and then become a proper historian, all that kind of stuff. This, of course, goes horribly, horribly wrong. She ends up landing in Plague era Oxford at the same time as the plague, rather than a little bit early. And things are horrible. Everybody dies around her. It's quite a read. It's especially disturbing to read right now. There's some really weird echoes going on there. So we've got basically this book where this woman goes back in time and she gets to see something she's not supposed to see, and she gets to record something that has not been recorded before. And I think that there's no accident there. There's absolutely no accident going on there. She is given a voice recorder of some description. Keep in mind, this is the early 90s, so they think, voice recorded, that's techie, isn't it? But a kind of voice recorded to record her experiences, her research and stuff like that. And she starts using it as sort of a journal. And towards the end of the novel, she starts basically listing what happens, where she's finding that the historical record that she knows doesn't necessarily line up. So for example, she's kind of comes more or less pre-programmed, like kind of sleep taught about how sort of Middle English goes, how to speak it, and it's completely wrong. She can't understand anybody. It's actually a lovely kind of thing that Willis does by making it look like a conlang, which is fantastic. And she basically goes, okay, took a while, I figured it out, but my clothes are wrong, my fingers should have chilblains on them, I'm way too clean, everything's wrong. So basically the idea being that the research she's doing of this lived experience is actually really, really kind of new and brand new. Interestingly, she notes that the only thing that looks the way it ought to is actually the church. Now, this I think is no mistake, because obviously one of the things that we would have lots and lots of archival sources around are places of power. And of course, at this point, the church has extremely large amounts of power. So that's really, really quite an interesting sort of thing that it's doing there. One of the other things she does while she's there, she manages to make a list of all the people who die of the plague while she's there, makes a note of them, says that they basically have a purpose and what's going on. Now, granted, in the novel, this is placed as a kind of a very kind of somber grieving kind of thing, a way of her dealing with the grief of these people she's lived with. But what it does is it does a kind of doomsday book thing. I mean, if you happen to know your medieval history, the doomsday book is broadly speaking, a kind of list of basically everyone who lived in Britain at the time, kind of what their land was like, all that kind of stuff. And what she's doing is kind of completing that to some extent. One of the other things that's actually quite interesting that she does is she basically says, look, I am the only person who can give proof that these people existed. Everybody else, everything has been lost in this village. Everybody dies. And she actually is able to bring those voices forward. She is able to be the voice for them. So I think what's really kind of interesting there is that basically what she does, what the PhD student does, is she becomes this kind of embodiment of the personal being the political. She is rewriting history in a really interesting way, not by changing things, but by adding voices, by giving voice to people who might not be able to speak. And I think what's really interesting about that is that basically what has happened here is that time travel has kind of allowed for that. And I realize I'm running out of time, so I can't really talk about the kind of interesting areas of where science fiction plays with this. But it basically, the kind of the what if questions that run science fiction, and if we're honest, all fiction, allow us to kind of go, okay, well, what if we could go back? What if we could look at these potentially alternate histories? And not alternate as in the sense of what might have otherwise happened, but what also happened in the kind of palimpsestuous kind of way that we think about history now. So yeah, I'm going to kind of leave it there, but that's sort of the basic kind of enormous ideas I've been sort of thinking about with this. So yes, I'll give that back over to Sabrina then, I guess.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And we're gonna move on to our fourth talk by Magdalena Wasowicz, who's gonna speak about alternate history and the politics of memory in Poland. And I hope, yes, hi.
Hi, yes, I'll be talking today about politics of memory and alternate history in Poland. I'm a PhD student who works on Polish, who prepares her PhD on Polish and American alternate history, and I'm actually mostly focusing on World War II. So what I'm going to present, just the highlights, of course, there's no time to present the whole topic, but I will present some highlights of what I do. As you probably all know, alternate history is a genre of fiction consisting of stories in which one or more historical events occur differently. It usually contains what-if scenarios and presents outcomes different than those in historical record, right? So one of the most popular scenarios is Nazi Germany winning World War II. In Poland, alternate history developed only after 1989, and it was, of course, connected with the fall of the communist regime, because the fall of the regime allowed for more free discussion of history and what history is, and on reinterpreting our Polish history. Many scholars have had difficulties on placing alternate history, on finding a correct framework for alternate history studies. And I think that Gabriel Rosenfeld, who proposed memory studies as a framework for analyzing alternate history, did a great job, because actually, especially in Polish context, memory studies, especially the idea of the politics of memory, is a great tool for analyzing alternate history. In Poland, collective memory is a breeding ground for conflict. It is constantly present in politics and public life. Politics of memory can be defined as all activities, conscious and unconscious, intentional and accidental, leading to the reinforcement and consolidation of collective memory, or of course to its change. So politics of memory is a kind of a social engineering which aims at changing or maintaining our perception of history. Alternate history and memory are very similar in the way they conceptualize the past. They explore the past, not for its own sake, of course, but to comment upon the state of the contemporary world. And in Poland, alternate history is really immersed in ideological and political discussions. This is clearly visible in Polish alternate history, regardless of point of divergence, be it Christianization of Poland, uprisings, or World War II. Although, as I have already said, World War II is the most popular point of divergence in alternate history, and both in the USA, Great Britain, or in Poland. Of course, this is quite obvious, since World War II was the event which defined the present. In Poland, some historians pondered the idea that maybe Poland should have acted differently during the conflict. One of very prominent Polish historians actually believed that Poland should have joined Nazi Germany. This was, of course, a very controversial and almost sacrilegious idea, since the idea of a disastrous yet honorable fight against Nazi Germany is one of great myths of Polish history and foundation for Polish collective memory. However, this idea of Poland joining Nazi Germany produced a number of novels, such as alternate history novels, of course, such as Marcin Wolski's Wallenrod or The Tempest, no allusions to Shakespeare here, or The Spectres, and so on. There's like 10 or 11 novels on World War II. In my PhD thesis, I analyzed those novels. They usually can be divided into two scenarios, utopian and dystopian. And of course, the aim of these scenarios is to validate or undermine the present, right? When they try to validate the present, saying that Poland acted well and Poland should have fought Hitler, they say that the suffering had sense, right? And that we live right now in the best possible version of history. On the other hand, when those novels try to undermine history, saying that, or providing a scenario in which Poland allies with Hitler, they say that the present could be better, that something could be better, and usually it stems from the trauma of communism, right? Those authors who believe that, who create who try to reinterpret World War II, they usually have some sort of trauma, and they believe that that communist regime was the worst thing that ever happened to Poland. So those novels are usually highly political, and they fit well in all discussions present in Polish public life. Of this ideological discourse present in Polish alternate history is what really stands out in those novels. And I believe Polish alternate history novels are much more political and ideological than American alternate history novels. And of course, those novels can be treated as some sort of symptoms of collective memories and collective traumas. And that's what I basically do, analyzing those novels, trying to entangle the way people in Poland think about World War II and what kind of discourse they create by writing about the past, but also writing about the present, right? Because when we write about the past, we obviously always comment on the present. And I'm running out of time, so this is, I think this would be all. So, and of course, if you've got questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So yeah, there aren't any questions quite yet in the chat, so I'm still encouraging people to put them in now. Other than that, I think since you also kind of spoke to each other beforehand, so all panelists can turn their cameras back on, should they wish to do so. And yeah, I guess I'll just leave it up to you to, because I know you discuss common strands of these papers. One common strand I obviously picked up on is maybe also to think about more why use science fiction to deal with history, or why use history to deal with science fiction. But those are the things that we kind of all have in common here, I think. But up to you.
Oh God, talk about the big question then. Why science fiction? Why history of science fiction? Sure. I might actually have said instead if Amanda might have wanted to start with that, actually, just because.
Perhaps you might give me some time to think.
I happen to know that you're quite critical of us historians, so you know.
We historians. I include myself in that very messy thing. I mean, it's an interesting thing. I mean, the first thing, because I've had about 30 seconds to think, thank you, is I have run across a disturbing number of historians who are also massive sci-fi nerds. And I find this really weird. So again, I kind of started off in the literature area, and sci-fi, fantasy, the gothic, horror, romance and stuff like that, all the genres are kind of ghettoized. They all hang out together, they all date each other, they don't talk with the rest of the department. Whereas almost every single historian I have met, and I'm now thinking of 2 or 3 people who don't fit into this, but they're all kind of nerds about this. And I think there's this kind of interesting question about needing to kind of maybe fill in blanks and think about how things might have been, which lines up very nicely with thinking about how things might actually become. It's using the same sort of part of your brain, I wonder. But I mean, that's the first thing that comes to my mind, at least. I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts, but that's just an observation I've had over the years now. What do we think?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've had the same experience, not with
yes, not just me. I'm so glad.
The Germans seem to be a little bit different. Not there are no sci-fi nerds among them, but it doesn't seem to be a required thing. I keep thinking to like that same part of the brain thing, right? That seems to me, because and this is something I've been trying to express also in kind of our prep here. This idea that, and I'm going off Koselleck here, this idea that Historia Magistra Vitae as a trope essentially treated the present as a vantage point from which you saw both history and the future, and history had already in it all the important things you needed in order for the future to make sense. So you look at thing A that is happening in your present that will become the future, you look back in history, you find the solution, you apply it, you're done. So it is literally the same kind of idea of the same part of the brain. Now that falls out of favor in the 18th, 19th century pretty hard, even though it still kind of holds on in popular imagination quite a lot. And so by the 1970s, which is kind of a point in which science fiction is becoming more and more a mainstream thing, historians themselves are grappling with this question: how do we now deal with past and future and temporalities? And not just historians. I mean, there's Luhmann and there's always Foucault somewhere in the background. To me, and I've tried to make this argument before, the new thing that they now do, or we now do, is to consider these temporalities as not the same, but as cognate in the present moment, as in we need constructivism to kind of come in, and now we construct them both out of the present moment. And so it does, again, use the same part of the brain. So we have a similar idea. We're standing in the present, looking in the past and the future, and we can attack them with the same kind of tools without having to go back to this bad old idea, which we all know is wrong. And that doesn't necessarily explain why all the historians are sci-fi nerds, but I do very much agree with this whole idea that there is the same part of the brain that kind of looks at alternate worlds, and also in the sense that you mentioned it, the alternate histories that aren't things that could have happened or should have happened, but things that did happen, but that weren't described, that weren't written down and presented to us as history. And now I'm going to shut up because I think I already went much too long here.
Maybe Magdalena wants to jump in on that as well.
Well, have to say that I agree with all your remarks, even though I don't actually know any historian, and I know quite a lot of historians, but none of them is sci-fi nerd. So that's a different problem. What is interesting, I would say that historians in Poland really hate alternate history genre because they see it as a way of trying to change history, as some kind of ideological discourse, and of course wishful thinking. I totally don't agree with this, because I believe that science fiction, alternate history are tools which help us to understand history, understand choices that people in the past had to make, because many characters in sci-fi travel back to the past, and they got to, so we as readers, as viewers, we watch the past through the lenses, right? And we can and thus we can understand what happened in the past. We can try to understand different mindset and difficult decisions that had to be made, right? And I believe this is very important for sci-fi, time travel novels, alternate history, that we face those decisions which historical characters had to make. And what is really interesting in this, at some point, Amanda said that the character of the novel, Doomsday, cannot change history. And I think this is the question of agency in history, in whether we can change the past by traveling in time, is a very interesting one, because it's a very philosophical discussion on whether history is shaped by people, or there is some kind of fate which orders history, and thus we cannot really do anything with it. We can just relive it, right? So it appears in many time travel novels, and most notably, I think, in also Outlander, where the main character tries to change history. She tries to prevent the Battle of Culloden to save her beloved Jamie, but she discovers she cannot really change history, right? She can just watch it happen. So I think this is very interesting and philosophical question: what to do with history, whether we have any agency in shaping history.
Bodie, did you want to comment on this as well? Otherwise, we have a question from Ashimi as well.
I noticed that there's a question sitting there, but yes, I do want to comment, sorry. Which is to say that I think that there's an interesting meeting in the middle here with history and alternate history, and then speculative future fiction, which is that, speaking from my perspective at least, as to, you know, I'm a historian and a sci-fi nerd. Why am I a historian who is also a sci-fi nerd? We often deal with these ideas of what ifs in history, but we're also kind of scared of them. The reason being, I've lost count of the number of times that I've taught classes where I've ended up having students ask me, so what would it have looked like if, let's take that cliche, if the Nazis had won the Second World War? And the answer is, well, I've got no idea, because A, it didn't happen, and B, what do you mean by them winning? When, how, why, what caused them to win? What happened that was different? And there's an infinite number of things that would have changed that mean that whatever that alternate history would have been, we simply can't say with any degree of not even certainty, but you know what I mean, what this might have looked like. Sci-fi kind of gives us the ability to fiddle about with that sort of thing without having the same sorts of consequences. So again, Second World War happened. I know what happened in that. I don't know what a world would look like where the outcome of that were different. But I can start playing around with the idea of a future in which the history hasn't happened yet. So I can start playing with those what ifs without actually having the so to speak, real world consequences in there. And I think that there's something of sort of intellectual gymnastics happening there that just lets us deal with that sort of issue without being that scared of it, really.
Yeah, Julia actually just is commenting and saying that current novels like Annalene Nevitz's Future of Another Timeline or Amal el-Mutar, This Is How You Lose the Time War, are getting kind of bringing up the notion of editing the timeline, and you know that history is malleable after the fact. So it seems to be a recurring issue. So yeah, Ashimi asked, do you think that sci-fi and the speculative on a larger scale as a genre, it seems to have a greater tendency to be experimental, is that arguably more political than other genres because of that experimental quality it has to it? Does anybody want to?
I'm making faces, but that's because I have to think about how I want to answer that. Because I specialize on experimental sci-fi, so you know. But I'll let other people talk while I'm thinking and try not to make too many faces.
So I have to talk without thinking. That's going to be a problem.
Welcome to my
I think it's. I'm not sure about the degree or like the more political, less political. I think it is easier for sci-fi to be overtly political, because it is not political in any specific understandable present moment. There is plausible deniability to get this kind of stuff out there, for it to be supported by the people who would be responsible for publishing it, for making television, making movies. It is because it's not real. It is not, you have just criticized a policy that a lot of people here support, and you're going to get some kind of consequence for that with your novel. It's going to be not regarded well or something. I think there is that element in there as well, which probably also exists in historical fiction, of course, bounded by the fact that that actually happened.
I think that there's something in there as well about sort of that plausible deniability, certainly there, but I also think the fact that sci-fi has the, I should stop saying sci-fi, SF, has the ability to sort of be very heavy-handed. I mean, Star Trek's an obvious example. It's always incredibly ham-fisted with whatever moral take it wants to have, but in a way that is understandable for an audience, and it's immediately clear to that audience what actually is intended. And I'll give a really, really quick example from Raumpatrouille, because it's kind of my favorite, which is, and I want you to keep in mind again that this show is just made 20 years after the war. So like very much in living memory, there's just been the Nuremberg trials. But it's something like the third episode in which an order is given for one of the aforementioned crew members, Artan, to hang around and decommission satellites or something like that, while the Orion goes off and deals with something. Now, obviously, as these things happen, the Orion is delayed, killer robots and all of that sort of thing, you know, exactly as it should be in this sort of show. And in the meantime, there's a problem with Artan's shuttle, and he's starting to run out of air, and the radiation shield has failed, but he keeps going, oh no, I've been ordered to do this, so I'm going to keep doing this, even if it kills me. And at the end, the Orion obviously comes back in exactly the moment that it really has to come back to save him. And he's asked by Major McLean, well, why did you keep going when you knew that this was the wrong thing to do? And he said, well, I was following orders. And the answer from McLean is, you've served with me long enough to know that you only follow, I'm paraphrasing, that you only follow orders as long as they make sense and as long as they're right. And if they're wrong, we do something else. Now, given that this is within living memory of the I was just following orders defense at the Nuremberg trials, this is a biting and very understandable and very recognizable political commentary by these producers. So I think that there is partially that, you know, we can explain it away as being fiction to give that deniability, but at the same time it becomes very clear in a different setting for any reader, viewer, audience that is taking this on board.
May I comment that it's also sometimes, however, interesting how many people still don't see the things, even if they're incredibly ham-fisted to us, because I mean, Star Trek has a long history of people claiming it never was political, it was never about anything, it was just about being in space.
Well, of course it wasn't political. William Shatner tells us it's not.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, like,
exactly the point, right? That's exactly why sci-fi both gets away with it, but on the other hand is a little bit constrained in being overtly political if people just don't get it, because it's not the actual thing. It is once removed from the actual thing.
Yeah, well, it's that the supposed impossibility of it, really. I mean, Samuel R. Delany talks about this idea of, you know, something that could happen rather than fantasy being something that cannot happen, things like that. It's more overtly political, but it's always couched in this kind of impossibility, which, as you say, gives a kind of that sense of deniability, but also that kind of, no, we weren't, we're just imagining things, all that kind of stuff. And I think the kinds of people that Sabrina's talking about have this for whatever reason, and every time I hear it, I think, have you been watching the same show I have? Like, really? Where did you get this from? But they have missed that kind of layer, very, very clumsy layering of metaphor and kind of satire there, which I wonder if it's that something around the ability to actually kind of parse that sort of content. So I think that's kind of a sort of important thing there, the ability to read beyond the kind of spaceships almost. Which is a skill you have to kind of put together, really. But that's me.
Since we're already getting towards the end almost, we have another very interesting question that also maybe Magdalena might want to answer first, which is between two Julias here. Because thanks to all the panelists for the amazing presentations. One more connection that seems to run through all the talks is trauma or traumatic periods of history, or a traumatic encounter with the future. Do you think that trauma can be a special site where speculative narrative meets the political? And Julia Gattermann had jumped in and said she thinks that trauma often can't be properly negotiated, especially across generations when there's gaps in history or information lacking or buried, but that fiction or SF might allow for some sort of narrative closure with that, and that might play into it. But maybe you can... obviously anybody, but I figured maybe Magdalena has a take on this, given she deals with World War II.
Yeah, actually, in alternate history novel, it's almost always about traumatic events from collective memory. As I said, in Poland, it's often about World War II, but also about Polish uprisings. In the US, it's also about World War II, but also the Civil War. So I believe alternate history, but also in general, speculative fiction is often connected to trauma in some way. We can also look at Octavia E. Butler's Kindred, where the main character travels back in time and she meets her ancestors who live on a plantation. Right, she's a black woman from the 70s, right, and she has to survive on a plantation in 19th century. So it's also like coming back to traumatic events from the past, and also I read it as a sort of story about trauma and how trauma haunts us and haunts next generations, right? Because it's often not only about what happened to us, but what happened to our ancestors. So I believe speculative fiction is often about trauma and also can give us some sort of closure, help us deal with it. So and I think it's very important.
Does anybody want to comment on that as well? Because after we have another more specific question about Raumpatrouille, which is, I think, also an interesting comment because it's the fairy tale from the day after tomorrow, and Uriam says that it's very interesting because kind of the day after tomorrow is very close in the future, whereas fairy tale often suggests like it's a utopian, it's unattainable, it's kind of far away from us. So what do you make of this? What is the tension there, and why maybe is there that phrasing of it?
I think this actually comes a little bit to what we've just been discussing before, actually, just the tension that exists between the reality and the speculative. So whether or not the writers are actually thinking about this as they're writing this admittedly lovely monologue to open the show, I'm not sure. But it seems to me that on the one hand, this show is meant to be set so far into the future, and there is the idea that this is a fairy tale, and there's the idea, I mean, the word that's used there, or rather the phrasing that's used, you know, at speed still unimaginable today. So it's not even unattainable, but it's that we can't even understand it today, that we can't even conceive of this. So on the one hand, this suggests that this is much, much, much further along. But then again, the day after tomorrow is, of course, not far away at all. I think that part of this is really, on the one hand, to tell us that we are looking at a fantasy. This is a story. This is an invention. But on the other hand, to almost signpost for us much of what we were talking about just before, that there are actually real world implications in here, that there are actually sort of parables or allegories here that we can apply to the world of now, or the world of, you know, a few hours into the future. I think that might be really where the tension or the synergy between the two lies. But I'd actually be interested, because I saw Torsten pull a face.
I'm not. It's just been thinking about because fairy tale also is inextricably linked, especially in Germany, with the national past and the nation building that comes about through fairy tales, which actually which are doubly invented in the sense that they are invented as German national, when they are just kind of like in the Central European canon generally. So and they are past. The fairy tales are almost always phrased in terms of the past. So again, the past is linked to the future through the day after tomorrow. So that to me was always incredibly striking about this, that they're linking back to it, and that they're also being speaking of signposting, they're being very meta about being an SF show. Like the first episode literally ends on the phrase after, I don't exactly remember the dialogue, but it was like, well, you know, was this the worst that it could have been? And then I think it was the character of Atan goes like, no, it was much worse. This was science fiction. And then it cuts to black and it's out. And you know that they have just put this out there, and they have made a statement that this is science fiction, specifically, again, deniability and all that stuff, but also with a twinkle of an eye, like literally right there. So that always struck me as very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that's one of those things that sci-fi always does. I mean, my PhD thesis was on metafictionality in science fiction, doing exactly those things. And it's part of that. They have this kind of what we would in literature call a transparent narrative, usually, not always. Once you get into the 70s, it gets a bit messy. But it looks like realism, aside from the spaceships, the aliens, the, you know, impossible things and stuff. But it's always got this kind of, it's real, but it's not sort of thing. And I think this show is doing something very interesting in there, especially in terms of time, because time is one of these sort of unexplored areas of metafictionality, I think, and how you kind of move yourself outside of time in order to talk about, you know, kind of make that sort of self-reflexive move almost. So I think, yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Julia's gone metafictionality ... And I'm like, actually, yeah, I think so. I very much think so, that's probably what's going on there. Not having ever seen an inch of the film or the show, but that's what it sounds like to me. Yes.
So we're actually already over an hour in. So yeah, I guess any last comments from any one of you, and then we're gonna wrap this up. Anybody have any famous last words?
Famous last words. This was great.
Yeah.
I really wish that the conference had actually been able to take place, but this is a really good way of having done it as well. Mm-hmm. I think I'm going to be brave and speak for all of us. I think that it's just really nice to be able to, in spite of everything that's happened, that we can still talk about these sorts of ideas in this sort of setting as well. I must admit, for instance, I've never thought about Polish alternative histories, but it seems such, then once Magda started speaking about this, it seemed so interesting to me that this is something that Polish writers hadn't really done until until 89. So, you know, this is great stuff. I'm so glad to have been able to take part in this.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, same,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And, some of our listeners are saying the same thing. So thanks for fascinating talks. And that Sam says she learned much, and she thinks Magda's right that generally Polish historians are not SF fans. I would agree that generally not all German historians are either. I think maybe our generation more than the ones before, but then
It's
With exception.
the weirdest thing, yeah.
certain exceptions.
So many of them.
In Poland, the new generation of historians who are also sci-fi nerds is just growing up, right? Because of all the changes and historical problems we had. So probably it's gonna happen.
All of us just have to get tenured, and then it's fine. On that note, I'm gonna stop the recording. So thanks everybody again, and bye.